Over my many years of writing software, I've built a lot of things with Vue and a lot of things with React. And one of the most common things you want to do in a front-end application is share data and state between pages and also between components. And in this video, we're going to take a look at how that is done in both Vue and React. Now, this is the second video in a multi-part series where we're taking a look at the same app that has been built with both Vue and React. In the last video, we took a look at this form validation example, and we mainly highlighted how state is managed within components. We also took a look at template syntax. And in this video, we're going to talk about sharing data between pages and components with this cart example. So for instance, you can add things to the cart. The status is displayed there. We also have a cart page. You can change the quantity or remove it from the cart there. But how is all of this working? How are we sharing that data? And if we take a look at the component hierarchy, there's a lot of different components that need access to this data and need to be able to modify this data, right? We have the cart status, we have the products page, which has a nested product component, and then it has a button that needs to add to the cart. We have the cart page with the product and cart component. It has a remove from cart button, but all of these things need access to the same data, and they need access to the same actions that modify that data. How is it done? Let's dive in. My name is CJ. Welcome to Syntax. Now, this video has been brought to you by Sentry. Sentry is an error monitoring platform. Essentially, it allows you to keep track of all the errors that are happening in production. It categorizes them. It can alert you when they happen. It's really great. You should definitely be using Sentry if you're running code in production. And Sentry has SDKs for many things, including React and Vue. So if you want to add it to your React app, they have an SDK for that. If you want to add it to your Vue app, they have an SDK for that. If you have any other type of app, they also have an SDK for that where you can add Sentry and start tracking errors in production. Now, when you're trying to solve this problem of sharing state between pages and components, one of the first bits of advice you'll get is to lift the state up. So essentially, if all of the state and methods are defined at the top level, then all of that data and state can somehow be passed down or accessed from these nested components, right? So let's say we have some shared state, which includes like items in the cart and then also actions you can perform on the cart. We can define that at the top level and then somehow get access to it in all of our nested components. Now, one of the ways you can solve this is with props. So you could potentially define all of that state and data at the top level here and then pass it down as a prop to all the components that need it. The issue is if any nested component also needs that data, it also has to be passed there, right? So even in the simplest case of this cart status component, the app has to pass that data down to the navbar, and then the navbar needs to pass that data down to cart status. It gets even worse when you have more levels of components because the app would need to pass it down to the page passes it down to the product component, which then can access it in the add to cart button. This is known as prop drilling. I've worked in code bases that have a lot of this, and it can get cumbersome very quickly. So this is one solution, but there are other ways of doing it that are built into both Vue and React. So if you take a look at React, they have the context API. And the way that that works is you can define a context that has some of this shared state and methods, and then you pass it into the provider. And the provider is a top-level component that must wrap all of the children that want to get access to that data and methods. So context provider is at the top here, and then every subcomponent is going to be able to get access to it, but without having to pass props. Because in any given component, you can use the use-context hook, which is built into React, specify which context you want access to, and you can get access to that data. And so this is nice because you can do it at any level of your component. So in these deeply nested components, I don't have to pass the props all the way down. I can just say use context right there wherever I need it. And so this is called the context API. It's built into React, and I'm going to show you an example with that. In Vue, there are a couple ways to do it. Now in Vue, your reactive variables actually don't have the same rules as like the use state hook does inside of React, because technically you could define all of your methods and reactive variables in a module and then just import it directly into any component that wants to get access to that data. Now, I wouldn't recommend this for large applications, but technically this is one way to do it. Now, you don't have to pass the props, you literally define it in one spot and then import those variables wherever you need them. But Vue is smart enough to see those changes regardless of where they're changed or where they're accessed. But again, in larger code bases, this could get a little bit messy. So Vue actually does provide an API called provide and inject, and it works very similar to the context API, where essentially at your top level, you say provide, you give it a name and pass in the initial state and methods, and then anywhere else in your component tree you want to get access to it, you say inject, and you pass in the name of the thing that you would like to get access to, and this can be done at any level of the component. So very similar to the context API, but you don't have to wrap your component tree in that provider component. You can just call provide and then inject in any of the components. So this is how it all works. Let's actually take a look at the code. We'll first dive into React and see how this is implemented with the context API. So first, I've defined a type that describes all of the data and methods that I want to share in my app. And we have items, which is the list of items in the cart. We also have total items, which is total number of items, taking into account the quantity of each item in the cart. We also have total, which is the total cost of the cart, and then 3 methods to operate on the cart. We have add to cart, update item in cart, and remove item from cart. So now with this type, I have defined a context. So in React, we have this method called createContext. I've told it that it should be of this type. And here I'm providing an initial value. Now, technically you can pass an initial value like null, but then everywhere in your code base where you try to use this context, you first have to check if it's null. I don't like doing that, so I kind of just have this empty value passed in here. Then in our top level component, we need to actually use this context. So here in my shop application, I have a folder called context, and I've defined this context inside of here. And if we take a look at the shop component, you can see that I'm importing that defined context there. And then right here at the top of my shop component, I have cart context dot provider. So essentially everything that's a child of this component is going to get access to the cart context value that I pass in here. So I have a use state here that defines that list of items and a method to update them. And then cart context has all of the other things that we need for this context. So we're passing in the items. We have total items in total, which are calculated based on the list of items. And then we have those 3 methods for operating on that list. Now, you can see here I'm using use memo, and that's because I don't want this provider to re-render unless the items have actually changed. So essentially, we have all the things that we need. We've bottled that up into a use memo, and this will only get recreated if the items array has changed. Now from here, in any nested component, I can use the use context hook. So you can see that I actually have some routes set up. I have the products page and the cart page, but you'll notice I'm not passing any props here. I've just rendered out those components. If we take a look inside of the cart page, we can actually see where we're using this context. So if I go in here to pages and then cart, we can see up at the top, I have use context. So use context comes from React, and then I pass in that context there that I created in the context folder. So essentially what will happen is because this cart component is a child of the cart context provider, this hook right here is going to get access to the data that was defined and passed into the provider here. So this one called use context actually gives me access to those things. And here on the cart page, I can iterate over the items in the cart and list them out. I can also show like the status of the cart as well. Now, another spot where we're using the context is inside the product component itself. If you look at the products page, the products page is just a list of product, right? It doesn't actually need access to the cart, but each individual product needs to be able to add itself to the cart. So if we look at the individual product component, we can then see that it actually uses the context as well. And all it's pulling from the context is that add to cart method. So in here, we have a little button, and when it gets clicked, it is able to actually add itself to the cart by calling that method. Now, on the cart page, we are listing out each carted product, but a carted product needs to be able to change its quantity in the cart and also remove itself from the cart, so we're using the context in there as well. So if we take a look at components and then carted product, we can see that we're using that context, but then we're bringing in those 2 methods that an item in the cart needs to be able to call. And then lastly, we have that cart status button, which shows us how many things are in the cart and the total price right now. And that's just bringing in total and total items and then reading them out there in the status bar. So that was the context API inside of React. Now let's take a look at the provide and inject API inside of Vue. Now here I have a type that describes my provider, very similar to the type that we described in React, but I'm using reactive and computed refs. So these come from Vue, and this is how we can define variables that are reactive inside of our Vue, and also variables that automatically get computed or recalculated when their dependencies change. Now, to define my provider, I have a folder here called providers, and I define the cart provider inside of it. Now here, I've exported a function called provide cart, and this is what I'll actually call at the top level component. Now, technically, I could write this code in the top level component, but I like to give it a nice name and then also include the type here so I don't have to do that wherever I provide this cart. You can see that I give it a name, and essentially anywhere that calls inject, whenever it references that same name, it's going to get that value. And then I have a function here that creates the cart. And this is where I've defined all of my variables and methods. So we have items, which is a reactive array. We have total items and total, which are computed. So these automatically recalculate if their dependencies change. And then we have our 3 methods for operating on that items list. Now this method create cart just returns an object that has all of those values on it. And that's what we're passing in here. Now, any component I want to use this in, I can bring in this inject cart method. Now, technically, you could write this code in any component where you want to inject this provider, but I want to put it in a nice named function here so I don't have to remember the string name of the cart or anything like that. So any component that needs this data can just import inject cart and call it. Now, you can see I'm also passing in create cart here. This just defines the value if for whatever reason there's a component that called inject cart but isn't a child of a component that provided the cart. This makes it so that we don't have to check if it's undefined. It's going to have an initial value there. But at the top level, I do want to provide the cart data. So here in my shop view, I have imported provide cart and then invoked it. And so now shop view is at the top level. Every child component is going to get access to the data that was defined here with provide cart. Now here I have this router view. This is where both the products page and the cart page are going to get rendered out. So let's take a look at those. First, if we look at the cart page, we can see here that I am importing that inject cart function. I'm calling it, and then I get access to the items that I need. So I'm able to iterate over the items here and then also render out an empty message if there are none, and then also display the status of the cart. Now, if you look on the products page, it doesn't need access to that provider because it's just listing out the products themselves. But inside the product component, we need to be able to add this item to the cart. So if we take a look at components and then product, we can see that we import inject cart. And in this case, we're just getting access to that add to cart method, which we can call whenever that add to cart button is pressed. Now, similarly, on the cart page, we have that carted product. It needs to be able to update the quantity in the cart and also remove itself from the cart. So we invoke inject cart, get access to those 2 methods, and then we can call them whenever those respective buttons are pressed. Lastly, if we look at the cart status, very similar. We're importing inject cart, getting access to those 2 things that we need, and then showing the status there. Now, on the surface, both of these implementations are very similar, right? Define your stuff at the top. Any component that needs it can just call a method to get access to it. But there are considerations to be made when we are actually rendering out the app. So here inside of React, I have the React DevTools installed. And then on the Profiler tab, I have highlight updates when components render checked. And so this is nice for debugging components. You can actually see when they re-render. But watch what happens when I add this product to the cart. This entire products page re-renders. And that's actually a limitation of the context API. But if you think about it, the products page only needs the add to cart method, right? It doesn't actually need any data from the cart. It just needs that method. But still, because we're using the context API, the entire subtree is re-rendering whenever that context data changes. Now, this is a limitation of the context API. Even though I'm using use memo here, still the entire subtree needs to re-render when that value changes. Now, there is an RFC that has been open since 2019 called context selectors. And essentially, this would introduce a way to get access to specific items in the context without needing to get access to the whole thing, which causes a re-render for any component that calls use context. But yeah, this was created in 2019 and it still has not been added to React yet. But there is a library in userland. It is called use-context-selector. And essentially what you do is if you bring this library in, you can use it to create your context and use your context. But then for anywhere that you use a context, you can pass in a selector function. And the selector essentially just grabs the specific things that are needed in that component. And then that component should only re-render if the things that it's selecting have changed. Now, I went ahead and tried this out. So in the repo, you can see there's another folder here called shop context selector. And basically all I've done is I've replaced the call to create context with the one provided by use context selector. And then anywhere where I need the context, I'm using the use context provided by the use context selector. So let's take, for example, the specific product component, right? So if I look in components and then product, it needs access to add to cart. That's the only thing that this component needs access to. So ideally, it should never re-render unless the add to cart method has changed. And so here I'm calling use context selector, passing in my context, and then my selector is just grabbing the add to cart method. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get this working. So in the React app, I've swapped it out. So it's actually using the context selector shop now, but we're still getting re-renders and I couldn't figure it out. So maybe I'm doing something wrong. But you can see here now it's using context selector, but still this is re-rendering even though this component is only getting access to the add to cart method. Now, I have a feeling it could be how I'm actually setting up the state here with use memo. If you know a way of fixing this, please let me know in the comments, but I couldn't get it working even with trying to use the use-context-selector library. Now in Vue, we actually don't have this problem. The reactivity system in Vue has what's known as fine-grained updates. So regardless of where you define state, the only places that are going to re-render are the places that actually access it. Now, I do have the Vue DevTools installed here, but I don't know of a way to do the same rendering flash like you see inside of the React DevTools, but it's actually pretty easy to implement. So here inside my Vue app, I'm adding a mixin, and basically this adds this updated method to every single component in my application, and I can get access to the underlying element, and I'm just adding some CSS here. So when that component is updated, it's going to flash an outline. And so I can do that with this little plugin here. Honestly, this should just be added to the Vue DevTools. But now with that enabled, you'll see that when I add to cart, the only thing that updates is this cart status up here, right? And that makes sense, right? Because that's literally the only thing that's changing on the page right now. Nothing about the product component has changed. So the only thing that needs to re-render is the area that's actually accessing that cart status. And you get this for free in Vue. You don't have to do anything special because that's just how the reactivity system works. Now, another consideration here is where you actually define your provided data. So in the React example, we define that cart context provider at the top of the shop component, right? So let's say I add a few things to the cart. If I navigate away from this shop component, that component completely unmounts, which means it removes that provider. So when I go back to the shop page, the data is no longer there. Now, the only way to fix this and make it so that the data persists regardless of which page I go to is to take that cart context provider and move it up in the tree, right? So right now it's defined here in the shop component, but if I want this data to stick around even when I'm not on the shop page, I'm going to need to take this context I've defined and the provider and move it up. And in this case, I would probably move it to the app. So I would have to define it here. And you see this in a lot of React apps. Essentially, you have a bunch of providers all wrapping the app to make sure that that data is accessible anywhere in the application. Now, over in the Vue example, I actually implemented it so that it would behave the same way, right? So if I add some things to the cart and then navigate away, all of that data disappears. But to make the data actually persist is actually fairly simple. So you can take a look here in Vue where we defined this provider, and you can see that when I define it, I'm invoking create cart here. But if I want this data to persist, all I have to do is move this into a variable, right? All I have to do is say cart equals that. I can pass it in here, and then I can pass it in here as well. And now, because this method only gets called once when the application is created, now this data persists throughout my application. So now I can just add things to the cart, but if I navigate away, when I come back to that component, the data has persisted because this cart was only created once when the application started. Now, the reason this works is because these reactive values that we define inside of Vue aren't limited to being defined inside of components like they are inside of React with like the use state hook. These can actually be defined anywhere, and then they will persist and your views will still continue to update. And so this is similar to the diagram that I showed earlier where you can actually define these things at the top level and then bring them in anywhere. But this is a nicer way of doing that because it's a bit more encapsulated, right? Instead of just importing this variable directly, you actually have to call inject cart, so it keeps things a little bit more manageable. But still, the way of sharing data here is just a lot nicer because I don't have to worry about like where that data is defined in the component tree. I can literally just define it inside of the module here. Now, in the world of React, typically teams reach for other libraries because of that issue that I showed with the context API, where any component in that subtree will be re-rendered if the context value changes. And there are a lot of different state management libraries in the ecosystem that people might choose from. So there's zustand, there's jotai, there's also recoil, and then also redux, which is a bit more involved. But all of these actually provide a solution for sharing state throughout your application, and typically does not have that issue of re-rendering the entire subtree of the context. And so for my shop example here, I actually brought in zustand, and we can see how that was implemented. So here I've defined a store. We have that exact same type as we saw for the context earlier. And then I have a few methods for calculating total items and total, and then a little helper function here that takes in a new list of items and then recalculates the total items in total there. But then all of these methods are used inside of this store. So with zustand, you can say create and then specify all of your initial state. And then you can provide methods that actually can operate on that state. And so here we have the set method, and essentially we get access to the state, and then we can update the state accordingly. So zustand is pretty nice. I will say that I don't like that I had to define these methods here. Essentially, these are computed values, right? They're dependent on the items array. I saw there are a couple of plugins for zustand for adding computed. I didn't exactly like their API, and it would be another library that I had to bring in. So ultimately, reading around, people were saying, yeah, instead of computed state, really you should just recalculate things yourself whenever other things change. So that's kind of how I implemented it here. But the API is pretty nice, right? I can define this store here. This gives me this hook called use-cart-store. And then in a component that actually needs it, so let's look at that product component again. We can call the hook and then pass in a selector of the thing that we want. So in this case, I'm asking just for the add to cart method on that product component. And so now if we actually watch the re-renders here, only this area of my app is re-rendering because zustand actually allows us to only pull in the things we need, and then the components only re-render when those things have changed. And in this case, the add to cart method isn't changing, only the status of the cart is changing. Now, in the world of Vue, we typically reach for this library called pinia instead of using the provide and inject API directly. Honestly, I didn't even know that API existed before I made this video because every app you come across is pretty much using pinia. There aren't really any other choices here, which is really nice, and especially because pinia is maintained by the core team. So if you need this kind of solution, you just bring in the pinia library. Now, I implemented our same shop example here with pinia. You can see I have a stores directory and then our cart.ts. And with pinia, we use this define store method, pass in the name of the store, and this gives us a nice reusable hook that we can use anywhere in our app. So I define this once here. Any component that needs access to this, we'll just call use cart store. And the way we define all the data in the methods is exactly the same as when I was showing with provide and inject, right? I have all of my computed values, my data here, and then I have the methods that can operate on it. And this just returns an object. And so if we take a look at our product component, you can see that it can call use cart store, and then it gets access to that cart itself. Now, the one caveat when working with pinia is if you are destructuring some of those data properties from your store, you do have to use one of their helper methods. So let's take, for example, the cart status component. This component uses total and total items from the store, but I cannot destructure those directly from the store itself, right? If I try to do that, you'll notice here that these are just the values themselves. They're not the actual reactive values. So if you want to destructure, you do have to use their helper method called store2refs, which basically takes those properties off of the store and then wraps them in either computed or reactive or whatever they're actually defined as inside of the store. So that way, when you're using these values down here, they are reactive. So that is one caveat. It's not amazing, but that is one thing you have to take into account when you're basically destructuring these reactive values from a store. So that's it for sharing state between pages and components. But the last thing I want to take a look at is how our state is actually updated in both Vue and React. Now, we took a look at this in the last video, but as your data gets more complex, your state updates get more complex. And so let's take a look. So here inside of React, I have this remove item from cart method, right? And we defined our items using useState, and I want to be able to remove an item from a cart based on its ID and size properties. And so the method for this is fairly simple. We can just use filter, right? So we have to call set items with a copy of the state and then remove that item that we're trying to remove. And so in this case, we just use array filter to pull that item out that we don't want in the cart anymore. Fairly simple. Inside of Vue, we can modify that item's array directly. So first, we find the index of that item. And then if it exists, we just remove it from the items array. And so I defined items as reactive here. We can just modify it directly, and then the Vue will update accordingly. But now let's take a look at update item in cart. And so this method is used over here on the cart page if I want to change the quantity of an item. And so in order to do this, we need to create a copy of the items array. So I'm using a map. And then for the specific item that I'm trying to update, if I find it whenever I'm mapping, I need to copy that item and then update the quantity accordingly. And for every other item in the list, I don't need to copy it. It can stay exactly as it is because its quantity hasn't changed. If we take a look at how this is done in Vue, first we find that element using find index. And then if I found it, I can just change the quantity directly. I don't have to copy it or map the array or anything like that. And then lastly, if we take a look at add to cart, this one is the most complex because let's say I'm on the products page and I want to add something to the cart that is already in the cart. If that's the case, then I need to adjust the quantity of the existing item in the cart, right? I don't want to add a new item. So if I add another small one, I don't want to see two smalls on this page. I want the existing one to increase its quantity. But if I add large, it should be a separate item in the cart. So we have to take into account all of that logic in our add to cart method. And so here in React, first we search for that item in the cart. If we didn't find it, then that means this is a new item. It's not already in the cart, and we just need to put it on to the end of the array. So I'm creating a new array, spreading the existing items that are in the cart, and then creating a new product in cart object here that has all of those properties. Now, if this item did already exist in the cart, we actually want to increase the quantity. So we do a similar update as to what we did for update item in cart, but instead of just setting the quantity directly, we increase the existing item's quantity by that specific quantity. And you see here, again, I need to copy the existing object and then update that property. But for all the other items, I don't need to copy them. They can stay exactly the same. If we take a look at how this is done in Vue, first we check to see, is the item in the cart? If it is, we just increase the quantity. If it's not, we push in a new item into that array. And so for me, this is one of the highlights of Vue, is being able to mutate state. You just have to jump through a whole lot less hoops. Now, there are solutions for this in the world of React. So there is this library called Immer, and it allows you to write code that looks like you're modifying the state, but under the hood, it actually is creating copies for you. And for example, it provides this method called produce. You pass in the thing that you want to modify. You write your code that just modifies it, but it's actually creating a copy and then under the hood updating that copy. So in React code bases that use this library, the state updates are a lot nicer. But I've worked in a lot of React code bases where nobody knew about libraries like that. And so you had all of this like spreading code and mapping code all over the place. And this only gets worse when you have deeper nested arrays, deeper nested objects. The spreading can definitely get out of hand. Now, built into JavaScript, there is this method called structuredClone, which allows you to create deep copies of objects. So you could use this, but in my specific example here, I actually don't want a deep copy, right? Because all of the items that haven't changed, I don't need to copy. Those can stay exactly the same. The only ones that I actually want to copy are the ones that have changed. And so structuredClone, technically you could use that, but you're going to be doing more work because you're copying more than you need to. And even if you use structuredClone in this example, you would still need to go find that item and then update it afterwards. So it's not a bulletproof solution. Now, even in the example where I use zustand, we still have to do immutable updates, right? So our code here to do the updates is very similar. However, zustand does have an Immer plugins. And so that way you would be able to do mutable updates inside of zustand. And that would definitely be my preferred way of working with shared state in React. You'd have to pull in a couple more libraries to get everything working. So that's it for these examples. Now, I wrote a lot of examples, including ones that I didn't even have time to show, like this reducer one. But if you want to look at those, take a look at the link in the description. All the code is there for you to look at. Also, like I mentioned earlier, if you saw anything that I've done wrong, or maybe you think can be done better, feel free to comment down below as well. Now, in the next video, we're going to be diving into this image search example, which allows you to search for an image. It hits an API, gets back the response, and then we also have some pagination here. So we're really going to be taking a look at like async state, loading state, and then also how I implemented pagination. So if you're interested in that, definitely subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you can be alerted when this video comes out. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in where you might be able to find this really cool shirt that I am wearing, you should subscribe to our newsletter. Go to syntax.fm/snackpack. Subscribe. You'll get 15% off swag in the swag store. And sometime this week, this shirt is going to drop. So if you want to be alerted, make sure you're on that mailing list. All right, I'll see you in the next one.